Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net. In this module, we're going to talk about Azure Storage Blobs. We're going to give it the same treatment that we've given tables and queues up to this point, where we're going to start by talking about what we already know about blobs and then move on and expand from there. So previously I said that the word blob actually is an acronym of sorts that stands for a binary large object. Blobs have been around for a very long time. When you think of a blob, think of files that are being stored inside of some data store. So in the past, you could create a blob in a SQL Server table and you could put an image or a document or whatever inside of there. And this is the same sort of thing where you're actually storing the bytes that represent a file inside of some storage mechanism, in this case, a container. So there's many practical uses inside and outside of Azure. Inside of Azure, we've already seen from the previous the previous course on Azure websites how it's been used. Additionally, it'll be used in virtual machines, which we'll look at in the next course, but we've seen it used for log files, for CDN origins, an origin folder, and for backing up, for log files, things of that nature. Okay, and the taxonomy is pretty easy to understand. You have the account, the storage account itself. An account can have multiple containers, and inside of each container you can have multiple blobs. And a blob can be of any file type and just about any file size. There is a maximum amount, but I doubt that we'll ever reach it. That can actually be stored in a blob container. And so most of the time, there's two different types of blobs. The first type of blob is a block blob, and the maximum size of a block blob is 200 gigabytes. So just think of just your typical files on a file system. Images, video, music files, documents of any sort, executable files, whatever you want to store up there, you can store up there. And that's what you're typically going to be using as a block blob. But there's also something called a page blob. And that's useful whenever you're going to write or edit or change something about that file frequently. You can change ranges of bytes inside of a blob by using a page blob, and that will store actually up to 1 terabyte. So I think this is the scenario where you're using it to store log files, and you need to constantly write and add data to a log file. That'll be stored as, I believe, a page blob. And we've already noted this when we were looking at the tools for Azure Tools for Visual Studio, that blobs are accessible using a URL where you have the storage account.blob.core.windows.net / the container name, then / the blob. And also we looked at in that same module how blobs can be in folders or subfolders underneath the container. And I said at that time that really there's no notion of some physical separation of folders and subfolders. It's really just kind of like appending to the actual name of the blob. It gives you some sense of organization. It can be represented as folders in a user interface, but all the blobs will be just stored physically under the same container. So when we think about blobs and we think about files, we're going to be utilizing those files in some way. We're going to upload them, and then they're going to be available to applications or to users or something or somebody. And so there's a couple of different ways that you can secure blobs. The first is obviously through the primary and the secondary management key, which you use to manage all resources within Microsoft Azure. The next is through a series of settings, or one setting that you put on a container. As you're creating a new container, you can choose one of 3 different settings, either private or public blob or public container. And let's talk about the difference between them. The private is the default container access value, so that means only this container is only visible by the owner. So you have to be logged in as the owner in order to actually work with the contents of that container and work with that blob. You can make the individual blobs available for read access, but the user will not be able to see anything about other files in the same blob or any information about the container itself. And then finally, public containers is full read access for both the blob and the container and all metadata associated with both of those. And then also, you may want a public container. You may want people outside of your organization to access those files. However, you might want to have some restrictions on how long a given hyperlink is usable. So the scenario that I put out there before is, and I use this myself for my own website, is that I make my video files downloadable by members of my own website, but I give them a link that expires after 10 minutes. So even if they share that on Twitter or they share that out on their own webpage somehow, my exposure is small. I'm not going to be feeding millions of people unless they happen to jump in on that link within that 10-minute window of time. So basically, in order to enable that, there's a technology called shared access signature. This works for tables and queues too. I just don't have the scenario in my mind where I would need it for that, but you can use it for that as well. And basically, it gives restricted rights on a given blob for a specific interval of time. And so again, the user can click it, can start the download process, and that hyperlink will no longer be active then after a certain amount of time. So those are the different ways that you can secure the blobs, allowing management, allowing container access, and then also giving people outside your organization access, but only for a limited period of time. And then finally, I want to point you to this, this shortcut that'll take you to the how to work with Azure Storage Blobs on Azure's own documentation. Just like we talked about with the queues and the tables, that's probably the best place to go to learn all of the basic usage of a blob from a software development perspective. So we're going to look at that in the next module specifically in more detail. But then beyond those basics, there are also several things that I want to demonstrate in subsequent modules. How to control access, that'll be pretty simple. We'll just show the different ways that you can control access to a file. We're going to look at leasing blobs for updating. So say that I did want to make a change inside of a blob. Maybe I'm going to write a different line to it or something. I'm going to need to lease the blob for a period of time so that somebody else can't come in and start writing. Another process can't start writing to that same blob while I have a lock on it, essentially, at least for a specific period of time. And then finally, I'll demonstrate how to use that shared access signature technology for blobs as well. Okay, so at this point, now let's get our hands dirty, work through some of these examples. We'll see you in the next module. Thank you.